Let's now talk about how to apply emission factors and use Formula Pharma and Apex as our examples. So let's start by taking a look at the steps you need to take to define and determine the emission factors that you need. Before you jump into collecting emission factors, it's important to review the activity data that you have. And that really means that the type and unit of your activity data will determine what emission factors and conversions you may need to do before being able to calculate and finalize your emissions. As you can see on the bottom of the screen here, we have two examples as to be used as illustrative examples of emission factors that match up with the activity data from both Formula Pharma and Apex. In the following slides, we'll dive deeper into these example calculations, but in both cases, you can see at the end that we end with greenhouse gases in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. This is what we will always be ending up with when calculating Scope 3 emissions. The type of activity data that you use will likely vary depending on the category, and so you'll apply different emission factors based on the Scope 3 category that you're calculating at that time. Let's first look at Formula Pharma and how they collected their activity data first. The first thing that they did, and you may remember this from earlier in this course, is that they had to define their emissions activities. They had started early in the footprinting process by defining a list of their upstream and downstream activities that may produce greenhouse gas emissions, and they then sorted that list into the relevant Scope 3 categories, which you can see here. They've broken it down into category 1, purchased goods and services, which includes contract manufacturing and chemicals procurement, as well as purchase of services through clinical trials. Another category that's relevant to their Scope 3 emissions is both upstream and downstream transportation and distribution. Those are categories 4 and 9, which really are made up of transportation of products to wholesalers, pharmacies, and hospitals, and their end-of-life treatment of sold products is really what happens to their products after they leave the facility, namely the medicines that they produce. So once they understood the list of all of those relevant emission categories, they looked at the activity data units. They purchase chemicals and CMO goods in weight of kilograms, and so that will be the units for that data. They spend money on clinical trial services, and they calculate their emissions based on spend. For transportation and distribution of products, they use a unit of quantity through ton kilometers. So that's really how much did they transport and how far did it go. The end-of-life treatment of sold products, they'd estimate based on spend or the dollar value of the products that are sold. Now that they have those units, let's look at how they applied the emission factors. Formula Pharma was able to define the appropriate emission factors and the associated units of each of those emission factors to use in their emissions calculations, which you can see here in the green box. In this example, the activity data gathered in kilograms for purchased goods and services will use an emission factor of tons of CO2 equivalent per kilogram. Alternatively, for the services with spend-based data, Formula Pharma will use an emission factor with the unit of tons of CO2 equivalent per dollar spent. The same goes on and on for upstream transportation and distribution, as well as the end-of-life treatment of sold products. As a reminder, if you cannot find an exact match for the units your activity data comes in with the units that the emission factor comes in, you may need to do some unit conversions and some multiplication and division to make sure that when you are applying emission factors, the activity data units and the emission factor units completely match. This will ensure that you have accurate calculations and that you're not overestimating or underestimating your emissions.